This for me is one of my favorite stories because it's about God breaking through, even in the worst times, even when it is hopeless, even when the future does not look good, and there doesn't seem to be a solution. So today I'm bringing you the story based on 1 Samuel chapter 29 and 30. And I'm telling it to you from the perspective of Abigail, who is one of David's wives. And I really hope you enjoy it and we can chat about it afterwards. Isn't today beautiful? I love days like this, when it's warm but not too warm, when there's a light gentle breeze blowing through our beautiful palace. And just having you here with me, you beautiful people of Judah, makes my heart warm and my joy is complete. But did I ever tell you about the time when David and I lived amongst the enemy camp? Did I ever tell you about it? Do you remember how I met David? He was an outlaw. He was fleeing before an angry, jealous king, King Saul. So when I met him, I was married to a man called Nabal, the fool. And I'm sure you remember, you must have heard on this palace gossip, how Nabal insulted David's honor and his men, even though they'd looked after all the sheep and the shepherds. And I had to pack supplies really quickly, and with my heart in my throat, ride on a donkey to go and face this band of warriors and plead our cause. And I always thanked God that He was so gracious that David's hand was stayed, and they accepted our gift, and our lives were spared as a community. And out of that, Nabal had a stroke and shortly later died. And when David heard that he had died, he sent his men for me. And I decided to leave the gilded cage and go on the run with my outlaw king. And this was long before we came here to Hebron. But shortly after that, David had confronted Saul in a cave. And he had spared King Saul's life again. And King Saul had promised again that David would be safe, he must return to the city. But in his heart, David knew that that was not going to happen. And because he was responsible for myself, for Ahinoam, his other wife, for the families of the soldiers who followed him so loyally, he decided we would move to a new place called Ziklag, which had been given to the tribe of Simeon back in the day, but we'd never taken possession, and it was still under Philistine rule. So we packed up this nomadic lifestyle in tents, which is very stressful and quite hard, and we headed into Philistine territory. And David went to one of the kings, his name was King Achish, he was the king of Gath, and he said to him, could he work in his service, safe from Saul's reach? And he found favor with the king, and the king said yes. And David said to him, we don't want to live here. Why would your servant live here in your palace with you? Could we have a small town just for us, far away, that's out of your way, because really we're just your servants. And he was actually being really clever, because in that way there wouldn't be jealousy from other people within the government, and we would be safe to practice our culture and our religion away from the Philistines. And so we were given Ziklag. And it was a lovely time. For the woman, it was so wonderful not to be on the move, not to be living in tents with soldiers making campfires. We actually had roofs over our heads and wells to draw water from. And it was wonderful. And even though we didn't fall in Israel, we still felt the honor and hand of God because we prospered. We did all right. There were about 600 fighting men in the army. And of course, they all came with their women and their children and their elderly who depended on them. And David became more than an outlaw. He became a raider. So him and the men would arm up and they would go and attack other settlements, particularly the Amalekite settlements. Now you know the Amalekites are one of the oldest enemies of our tribe. When God first brought us out of Egypt, they were the first tribe to attack us. Even though we were hungry and broken, they came against us. And they've done it so many times that God had actually said to Saul, destroy them, every last one of them, for the evil that they have brought against Israel. And although Saul didn't have the opportunity, he didn't take it. He let their king go. And so the Amalekites are still around and still preying on Israel. So David would take his men and they would go and surround the village. And they would attack. And they would take everything, leaving no one alive. And our wealth grew, our livestock grew. And our numbers grew. More and more people were disillusioned with the ungodly rule of King Saul, and they were escaping to us. So although we were still outlaws, it was a fairly good time. Now, King Achish was one of 5 kings that ruled the Philistine territory. And David would report back to him that he'd done these raids, but he wasn't always very honest about who he'd raided. Because he didn't want King Achish to know that he was destroying Israel's enemies rather than Israel. And the 5 commanders of the Philistines decided they were going to attack Israel on force, not one by one, all of them. So up to the north at Apex, they had started to gather their forces. And when you brought all 5 kings together, there's hundreds of thousands of men gathering to fight Israel. Now David and his 600 or so men were part of Achish's army, so they went too. And when they got up north, it's a long travel, takes about 3 to 5 days. They got there and they settled at the rear of the army. But those other 5 commanders remembered David. They remembered the young man who had started his military career by slaying their giant, Goliath, and chopping off his head. They remembered that in Israel, the women had sung songs about David, who killed thousands of men. And those men were Philistines. So in their anger, they went to King Achish and said, how can you do this? What if he attacks us from the rear? They'll destroy us. How do you know he's loyal? He said, I know he's loyal. He's mine. He works for me. They said, you might trust him. We do not. Send him home. And you know, when David told me what had happened later on, he said they were really cross. Because for those who wanted to go to war, you earned spoils from war, so your wealth increased. And maybe there were some who felt that they would like to fight on the side of Israel and give them a chance against this massive Philistine army. But they had no choice. They had to leave. So disgruntled, irritated, angry, the 600 men started the journey home. On horseback, they were doing about 40 kilometers a day, which is quite far. Sleeping rough at night, eating what they carried. So when they returned to Ziklag, and they arrived at the outskirts of the town, they arrived tired, hungry, spirit-weary. But there was no welcome there. There were no wives waiting to greet them, no meals to feed their hunger. For a horrible, horrible shock had just bombarded their senses. Because when they had left, we waved them goodbye, as women do, and we saw them going with the sun flickering on their swords, their saddle packs packed with provisions for war. And we knew it could be weeks, months before they could return to us. And as the dust settled behind their horses, we turned back to our daily lives, working in the fields, looking after children, livestock, cooking, cleaning, looking after the elderly. But shortly after they left, I can remember the days standing looking out at the windows, watching the children play in the sand. And they were laughing and giggling and arguing over a bunch of figs. And these things we heard hoofbeats, but not from the direction our men had gone. And it got louder and louder. And then the screaming started. And the screams of terror tore our little town apart. For the Amalekite raiders had come. They knew our men were gone, and they had taken the opportunity for payback. They arrived with swords. They arrived with anger. They arrived with their brutality. And with sword and hooves, they marshaled us into the center of the town. I remember I had dropped the oil and it had fallen all across the floor and stained my feet, and that dust was on my feet as they herded us like cattle out of our town. When I looked behind, our livestock was being brought with, and our town burned red with fire as they torched every house and dwelling, leaving nothing behind. They pushed us fast. They went hard because they wanted the tracks to disappear. And we weren't the first tribe they had raided. They had lots of livestock and other hostages in their care. And during the day as we walked and they rode, shouting, prodding, yelling, threatening, my heart was in my throat. Noam and I were trying to take care of the children, trying to guide them together, trying to carry the elderly who couldn't move at that pace. But these were brutal people. There was no water, no mercy. We just kept going. And that night, as they sat around their fires, we huddled together, the children in the middle, trying to give them some protection. The women trying to give each other some warmth and some hope that it looked hopeless. The men tormented us. They shouted at us and said, "Your men are gone to war. They'll never find you. You are ours, to do with as we wish, and we despise you." And what do you say when you know that it's true? After a few weeks, there are going to be no tracks left. Anything we dropped is going to be blown away by the wind. So we were faced with two options. We could try and escape and die a brutal death with the sword, or we could submit to a life of slavery, abuse, and suffering. I know that night I prayed, but I didn't know what to pray. I prayed, "God save us. God rescue us." But I don't know how. Israel won't fight for us. We are the outlaws. Our men are away. We are alone. And I can't remember how many days we walked because they started to blur. Days of very little water, very little food, hunger gnawing at your belly, your muscles aching as you walk. Your arms felt like they were going to fall out their socket from helping carry the children, helping the elderly to keep up. To give you an idea of how brutal these men are, one of their own Egyptian slaves fell sick one day, and he couldn't keep going. He collapsed. He was property that they owned. You'd think they would put him on a horse. They just kicked him to the side and left him to die. So we knew there was no mercy for us. And about 3 days after that, we pitched camp, and we must have now been quite far from Ziklag, and quite far from the other territories they'd raided, because the men relaxed. No longer were they pushing us just to get away. Now they started to revel in their victory. And the mockery continued. And they no longer had sentries around the camp because they felt it wasn't needed. And the wine flowed freely. And they got drunk and disorderly. And they were lying all over the camp, feasting, celebrating, looking at what they had, enjoying the spoils of war. And you know, that evening, when I was helping one of the children, I looked up, but the campfires were lit, and I thought, did I see a flicker of movement outside of the camp? It's just that hope that flickers in a hopeless moment. And I muttered under my breath, and I turned and carried on, and we put the children to bed. But the next morning, before the sun came up, we heard hoofbeat. We heard the sound of war cry and shouting, and it was Israeli. Our hearts, we gathered the children and held them close, for here came David and his army to rescue us. And as the sun came up and those drunk Amalekites couldn't raise their hungover heads, they swooped down upon the camp with their swords raised and their eyes ablaze. They annihilated our enemy. The battle took an entire day, a day of bloodshed, a day of revenge, a day of slaughter. By nightfall, only a few hundred had escaped on camels into the desert. The rest lay dead on the ground. And just for a moment, my heart stopped because I couldn't see David. Had he died in this? And then, amongst all the men dismounting, and the cries of women finding their husband, and men finding their children, I saw David. And he got off his horse, and I ran to him, and he held me so tight, and his arms shook with the weary battle fatigue, and he smelt of sweat and blood. He smelt of war, and he smelt of home. And Ahinoam came and joined us, and we turned to look around at the devastation and at the miracle. For do you know, not one of our women had been hurt. Not one of our children lay injured. Not one of our elderly did we lose. And so David began to gather up the people, to collect the Philistine spoils of war together with our own things. And the next day we started the journey back. And while we were walking back, David stopped and walked with us. His horse was tired, so the soldiers simply made a wall around us and walked with the people. And he began to tell us how he could be there. He was meant to be in the war. And he told us how the king had sent him home, and how they had got to the town of Ziklag. There was a flame. There was nothing, not a living beast in the field. Not one small dwelling still stood. And he said they were tired, they were hungry, they were devastated. The people, the men, had cried so much until they could cry no more. They believed their families were destroyed. They believed they would never see their wives or their children again. In fact, their despair was so deep, they threatened to stone David because he was the reason they'd gone to war. He was the reason they were in Ziklag. And David, from the depths of his despair, he turned to Yahweh. He called for the priests and a prayer apron. And he asked God, should they chase us down, would they succeed? And they got word from Yahweh, yes. Chase them down, leave now, you will succeed. And encouraged by those words, those weary, exhausted, drained men gathered what little supplies they could, and they mounted up and they pursued us. And because it was only days, not months, our tracks were still visible, so they followed us. They followed us relentlessly until they came to the Bezel Valley. And then, out of the 600, there were 200 who were so weary, they just could not go on. Remember, they haven't eaten properly. They haven't slept. They've hardly rested from running, and they just could not go on. So David said they could stay there and wait and look after any extra supplies, and they left behind everything except what they needed for battle, and they kept going. And shortly after that, per chance, or should we say per God, they came across a man in a field. And this man was close to death. He was obviously thirsty. He was starving. And so David's men brought him to David. And they gave him water to drink. And they gave him thick cakes and cakes of raisins. And he gobbled them down. And once he was able to speak, he told them he hadn't eaten for 3 days. And David said, "But who are you?" And he said, "I'm an Egyptian slave to the Amalekites. And they left me here for dead." And he said, "We have just finished raiding on the outskirts of Judah, Philistine, and we burnt Ziklag to the ground." And David said, "Can you tell me where their camp is?" And the man feared for his life, so he begged David, "Please don't kill me. And please don't give me back to them." And David promised he wouldn't. So the Egyptian slave that we had seen left behind for dead told David where we were. And when David and his men got there, they had seen the men drinking, reveling, eating, and they decided they would leave them to sleep it off, to be nicely hungover before they attacked. So it was one of them I had seen through those flickering camplights. And you know, one of the young boys who was walking near to David said to him, "But didn't you feel a bit nervous going into the attack with a third of your army missing?" You know what David said? He said, "My boy, I didn't. Because I was going on God's promise, not on the numbers of horses, not on the number of swords. God said we would succeed. So all I needed was me and willingness to go." And when we got back to Ziklag, it was burnt down. We had been there for close to 18 months. And we started to repair it, but the joy of knowing that we had all survived, the incredible faith of knowing God had his hand on us. If David hadn't been sent back by the pagan king, he would never have found us. If those men hadn't been quite so evil and brutal, they wouldn't have left an Egyptian to point the way. God's hand was all over every calamity, every hardship, every hurt, every moment of hopelessness. We felt that, but God was still there. And that battle between the Philistines and Israel, it raged. The Philistines were strong, and Saul knew he was losing. So the great King Saul took his own life. And sadly, in the battle, his 3 sons, including David's best friend Jonathan, died. And when we heard that, got word from the battlefields, we didn't rebuild Ziklag. We packed up. We came here to Hebron, where David, after all these years, fulfilled the prophecy that the great prophet Samuel had made over him, when he had anointed him king of Judah. And he has been crowned king. And we know Yahweh reigns. We know, no matter how long it takes, no matter how hard it looks right now, no matter how dim your future looks, there's always hope. Because Yahweh is good. Yahweh is faithful. And Yahweh's love comes through on every promise for all of his people.